Have you ever stopped to actually think about how your body commands and controls, well, everything you do? From a microscopic spark happening in a fraction of a millisecond to the wildly complex processing of the human brain, there's literally a hidden universe of communication happening inside you right now. Welcome to this explainer on the neural system, where we're going to decode exactly how this incredible biological machinery works.
Here's a quick roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The need for coordination. 2. Meet the neuron. 3. Firing the nerve impulse. 4. Crossing the synapse. And 5. The human command center.
All right, let's kick things off with part 1, the need for coordination.
Picture this. You go for a run, and almost instantly, your heart rate and breathing pick up. Now, this doesn't just happen by magic. It happens because your organs are constantly talking to each other through a process called coordination. When you exercise, your muscles are working harder, right? So they demand more energy and oxygen. That suddenly requires your muscles, lungs, heart, and blood vessels to all perfectly sync up to maintain homeostasis, that absolutely vital internal balance. And when you stop, everything gradually ramps down together. It's a brilliant, full-body collaboration.
So the catch here is that our body uses two entirely different systems to pull this coordination off. On one hand, you have the endocrine system. That one provides chemical integration all over the body using hormones. It's a slightly slower, more broadcasting kind of method. But on the other hand, you have the neural system. This is an incredibly organized network of point-to-point connections built for quick, instantaneous coordination. And for this explainer, we are focusing strictly on this lightning-fast wiring of the neural system.
Moving right along to part 2, meet the neuron.
Let me introduce you to the star of the show, the neuron. This is a highly specialized, excitable cell that acts as the core structural and functional unit of your neural system. Its one and only job is to detect, receive, and transmit different kinds of stimuli. A neuron is basically made up of 3 major parts. First up is the cell body. Think of this as the main processing hub. It contains the cytoplasm, your typical cell organelles, and these specific granular bodies called Nissl's granules. Radiating off of that hub are the dendrites. These are short, repeatedly branching fibers that basically act like antennas, catching incoming impulses and sending them toward the cell body. And finally, we have the axon. This is a long single fiber that takes those impulses and shoots them away from the cell body, sending them down the line to a synapse. So, dendrites receive, the cell body processes, and the axon transmits. Simple enough, right?
Now, depending on where they are located in your body, some of these axons are actually insulated with a myelin sheath to help speed up signal transmission. These myelinated nerve fibers are wrapped up in Schwann cells, and you'll typically find them in your spinal and cranial nerves. And those little gaps you find between the adjacent myelin sheaths, those are called the nodes of Ranvier. On the flip side, we also have unmyelinated axons. These are still enclosed by Schwann cells, but they skip the thick myelin sheath entirely, and they're super common in the somatic and autonomous neural systems.
Which brings us to part 3, firing the nerve impulse.
Okay, before a signal can even fire, the neuron is just sitting there in a resting, polarized state. Which brings up a pretty fascinating question. Why is the membrane of a resting neuron polarized in the first place? Well, it all comes down to a very specific, highly regulated gradient of ions across the cell membrane. Firing an impulse relies on this incredibly precise 3-step chemical dance between sodium and potassium ions. It starts with the resting potential. The neuron actually uses a sodium-potassium pump to actively shove 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions it pulls in. This leaves the outside of the membrane positively charged and the inside negatively charged. Then, boom, a stimulus arrives, triggering step 2, action potential, or depolarization. Suddenly, the membrane throws its doors open to sodium. Sodium rushes in, and the polarity rapidly flips so the inside becomes positive. That sudden electrical difference, that is the actual nerve impulse. Finally, in step 3, restoration. In literally a fraction of a millisecond, potassium diffuses outside the membrane, resetting the resting potential and preparing the whole fiber to fire all over again.
And this impulse doesn't just happen in one spot, it travels. Think of it like a biological domino effect. The reversed polarity at site A creates an electrical current that flows right over to site B on the inner surface. Meanwhile, on the outer surface, current flows from B back to A to complete the circuit. This triggers a continuous chain reaction that conducts that impulse all the way down the entire length of the nerve fiber.
Okay, part 4, crossing the synapse. So what happens when that impulse hits the end of the line? It has to jump to the next neuron through junctions called synapses. There are 2 main ways this happens. With electrical synapses, the membranes of the 2 neurons are incredibly close together, allowing the electrical current to just flow directly and rapidly across.
But interestingly enough, those are actually quite rare in our system. Instead, we heavily rely on chemical synapses. Here, the membranes are separated by a tiny fluid-filled gap called a synaptic cleft. Because of this gap, you need a chemical messenger to bridge the crossing.
Here is exactly how that chemical synapse plays out. When the action potential arrives at the bulb-like terminal of the axon, it forces these little circular sacs, called synaptic vesicles, to move right up to the edge of the membrane. They fuse with it and dump their cargo, specific chemicals called neurotransmitters, straight into that fluid-filled synaptic cleft.
Once they're released, these neurotransmitters dart across the gap and bind to specific receptors waiting on the membrane of the receiving neuron. It works exactly like a key fitting into a lock. It forces ion channels open, letting ions flood in to generate a brand new potential in the next cell. So think about what just happened. The electrical spark briefly transformed into a chemical message to cross a bridge and then immediately turned back into an electrical spark on the other side. It is just an incredibly elegant solution.
Finally, Part 5, the Human Command Center.
All those afferent nerve fibers we talked about, the ones bringing sensory data from your tissues and organs, they transmit their impulses straight to the central neural system. The CNS, which is made up of your brain and spinal cord, is the primary site of information processing. It acts as the ultimate, undisputed command and control system for your entire body.
Safely locked away inside the skull and wrapped in 3 protective layers of cranial meninges, the dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater, the human brain is an absolute architectural marvel. Here's a wild fact for you. Despite making up only about 2% of your overall body weight, your brain consumes a massive 20% of your body's energy. Anatomically, it's divided into 3 major regions: the forebrain at the top and front, the midbrain tucked deep in the center, and the hindbrain at the lower back leading right into the spinal cord. And these different regions take on very specific leadership roles. Your hindbrain, which holds the pons, cerebellum, and medulla, handles crucial background operations. We're talking respiration, cardiovascular reflexes, and keeping your physical balance. The midbrain serves as a major integration hub for visual, tactile, and auditory inputs. And then you have the heavy lifter, the forebrain, containing the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. This is the region managing your memory, communication, body temperature, and your deepest emotions.
Let's actually zoom in on that largest part, the forebrain, because this is where our most complex human behaviors and thoughts are born. The cerebrum is split into left and right hemispheres, connected by attractive fibers called the corpus callosum. It is completely covered by the highly folded gray matter of the cerebral cortex, which is packed with association areas for memory and communication. It wraps right around the thalamus, your body's major switchboard for sensory and motor signaling. Just below that is the hypothalamus, controlling primal urges like eating, drinking, and regulating your temperature. And deeply connected in the inner parts of the cerebral hemispheres is the limbic system. That's the system regulating everything from motivation to intense emotional reactions like pure pleasure, rage, and fear.
We'll wrap up with this pretty profound summary directly from the source text. The brain acts as the command and control system. It controls voluntary movements, balance, vital involuntary organs, and is the site for processing of vision, hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotions, and thoughts. Honestly, isn't it absolutely mind-blowing to realize that you just used this exact, highly coordinated neural network of electrical impulses and chemical synapses to process, understand, and remember the mechanics of your own brain? It's a biological system constantly working to understand itself. But with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses firing away inside you right now, one really has to wonder, how much of this inner universe is still waiting to be discovered? Thanks for tuning into this explainer. Keep feeding that brain and stay curious.